Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming out tonight. Welcome. Good to see each and every one of you. Starting to see some of the winter faces coming down, which is always a pleasure. Tonight's speaker is no guest to our synagogue. He's been here almost every year. And it's always wonderful to have him back because obviously he's one of the leading experts who could help us understand the Middle East. Daniel asked me before, what should I speak about? And I pretty much said everything. Because there is so much to talk about, as you all know, between the rising tensions in Jerusalem, the impending deal with Iran later this month, and of course the war this past summer. So we're really looking forward to your comments. So I'd just like to introduce our speaker tonight. Daniel Pipes is an American historian, writer, and political commentator. He is the president of the Middle East Forum and publisher of the Middle East Quarterly Journal. His writing focuses on American foreign policy in the Middle East. He'll be speaking for about 30 minutes and then spend the second half of the hour taking your questions. Please give a warm welcome to Daniel Pipes.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Schneider, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a delight to be back at the Palm Beach Synagogue. I'd like, before I start, to recognize Philippe Carsanti, who's here from France. You may remember the Mohamed Doura affair. He is the one who challenged the French television. He's challenging others as well. As the rabbi said, I will talk about a range of subjects. I'd like to talk about Turkey, Syria, Iran, Arab Israel, Egypt, and U.S. foreign policy. Actually, not Syria. Syria, Iraq. It's all one big mess now. So let me do it geographically and just spend a few minutes on each and give you some thoughts and some interpretations and some predictions. Turkey has been a member of NATO for 62 years. Until recently, until a decade ago, it was a very good ally in a strategic part of the world. But since 2002, it's been under the leadership of Islamists, the people who want to apply Islamic law. And it has turned. It has turned ever more, obviously, in the last couple of years. It's turned against not only Israel, but against the United States, Europe, Egypt, Iraq, Iran, Cyprus, Greece, you name it. This new government, or not so new government, this 12-year-old government has had a policy of no problems with neighbors, and in fact has more problems with neighbors than any of its predecessors. I worry that this government is a long-term danger, the long-term danger in the Middle East. Iran is obviously the short-term danger, what with the terrorism and the buildup of nuclear weapons. But I expect that when the Islamic Republic of Iran is overthrown in some way before too long, the Iranians will be our friends. And at that time, we will see that Turkey will be the great problem. It is a powerful, big country with a growing economy, 75 million people, and it, I think, will be our great problem going forward. And I say this with great regret, as someone who enjoys going to Istanbul, who enjoys Turkish food, who enjoys the sights and sounds of Turkey, but Turkey, our longtime ally, is no longer one anymore. Syria and Iraq. What's happened in Syria and Iraq is extraordinary. In many ways, the modern Middle East came into being in the decade around World War I, between 1913 and 1923. The Middle East has been a very sleepy place. In fact, one could argue that for 400 years, barely anything happened. And then came the tumultuous decade around World War I. Empires such as the Ottoman Empire fell, and the imperialists, the French and British, moved in. And the map of the modern Middle East was created back then. The Balfour Declaration, for example, from 1917. And I like to say that the past century has been a working out of the details of the changes that took place in that long ago era. Well, one of the more key decisions made was a French-British secret carving up of the Middle East called the Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916, which created modern Syria and modern Iraq. And these states have existed now for a century. And they've been complete failures. Just to mention the names Hafez al-Assad, Bashar al-Assad in Syria, and Saddam Hussein in Iraq, remind you of what terrible failures they have been. Well, in a very striking development back in June, a hitherto small terrorist movement gained control of Iraq's second largest city, Mosul, with a population of nearly 2 million. ISIS, ISIL, Islamic State, Daesh, call it what you will, has emerged as an extraordinary phenomenon. It is now has building an air force. It is at the border of Turkey, threatening to take Kobani, a very important town. It's at the border of Baghdad. It's in the suburbs of Baghdad, threatening to take the capital of Iran. It has created an extraordinary turmoil among Muslims in the Middle East. It's my expectation that this state, as it now is, controlling an area as large as Great Britain, will not last. It has too many enemies. It is too rambunctious. It is too violent. It is too murderous. I believe it will fall almost as quickly as it arose. And I think the long-term significance of this Islamic State is the recreation of the caliphate. Now, you've probably read that the caliphate existed until 1924, which is correct. But from the 940s on, for 980 years, from the 940s to 1924, it was a symbolic caliphate. The caliphate actually had no power. The caliphs were either individuals with no power at all, or were powerful individuals who added the title of caliph. So what Caliph Ibrahim did on June 29th of this year in creating a caliphate was to resurrect an institution that had been defunct for over a millennium. Not since the 940s, not 1940s, 940s, had there been an executive caliph, a caliph of power. And this has had a tremendous impact around the Muslim world. Muslims have responded to this with excitement. And I think we will see both allegiance to this caliphate, rival caliphates appear, and governments beginning to declare themselves caliph. I would not be surprised if the Turkish government, or the Saudi government, or even the Iranian government declare themselves a kind of caliphate. And I think the significance of this is a further turn towards extremism in Muslim society. I see it as a very negative development. The caliphate is not a good thing. It is an ancient institution that has been dead for a long time, and its revival can only lead to more trouble. Arab-Israeli, where does one start? Let me give a good background and then address the current issues. The key event in modern Arab-Israeli developments was the Oslo Accord of September 1993, just over 2 decades ago, when it seemed that Arafat, on behalf of the Palestinians, had come to accept Israel as a Jewish state. Well, I think it's pretty clear, at least 21 years later, that he didn't do that he was in a position of crisis. The Soviet Union had collapsed, Iraq had been defeated, the PLO was in trouble, he needed a lifeline, and he got one on the White House lawn. He never accepted Israel. It was a tactical move for momentary gain. But despite that, it fundamentally changed the politics of the conflict. And so now, formally speaking, the PLO, or Palestinian Authority leadership, is a partner for peace with Israel. And the Israelis are committed to working with Mahmoud Abbas. By the way, it was 10 years ago yesterday that Yasser Arafat died. Mahmoud Abbas has been in charge this decade. The Israelis are committed to working with him to find a diplomatic solution to their troubles. And the assumption is, in the United States government, and in Europe, and throughout the world, that if only you can get it right, if only you can find the right circumstances, the right move, the right timing, a final resolution to the Palestinian-Israeli problem will be achieved. In other words, on the White House lawn 21 years ago, the basis was set, and now it's just a matter of working out the details. I don't think so. I think that there is no acceptance of Israel by the PLO leadership, the Palestinian Authority leadership. And yes, there are some Palestinians who accept Israel, but they're not the ones in charge. The ones in charge do not accept Israel. They do not accept it as a Jewish state. They do not accept any aspect of it. They want to eliminate Israel. They want to eliminate it no more, no less than they did before before the Oslo Accords. Nothing fundamentally has changed, in fact, except that the Israelis now have to go through this pretense of a two-state solution in which the Palestinians accept a small Palestinian state next to Israel and are good neighbors together. Well, all you have to do is look at the map that the Palestinian Authority uses, and it's always the whole of so-called Palestine. There's never a little Palestine next to Israel. Everything you look at, the sermons in the mosques, the cartoons, the crossword puzzles, the news items, the historical scholarship, everything points in one direction, which is non-acceptance of Israel. And yet, because of the Oslo Accords, in polite society, you can't really say this. And if you do, for example, argue this with someone in the State Department, he will give you all these formal reasons why the conflict is nearly resolved. But it isn't. And furthermore, while Mahmoud Abbas is really not as bad as Arafat, he's a weak individual, a weak leader, and Hamas, which outright doesn't accept Israel, is doing well. And so he has made concessions to Hamas and made concessions to the Palestinians who are absolutely opposed to Israel. And so what you've seen now in the last few months, since the end of the carry round of negotiations in the summer, is rejectionism, pure rejectionism on Abbas's part, reminiscent of what the Mufti Haj Amin al-Husseini did in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, reminiscent of Arafat in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, absolute no to any kind of deal with Israel. And furthermore, condoning, if not outright calling for violence against Israelis. And that's what we are today. In one sense, it shows it's positive in the sense that it shows that this is a formula, that the negotiating notion is defunct, it can't work. But in another way, it's tragic, because once again, the Palestinians are missing a chance to move forward. The Israelis have shown over and over again a willingness to make concessions, painful concessions, and the like. So where does this leave us? Well, I reject the entire structure of diplomacy. The diplomacy is based on the idea since 1993 that the Palestinians have accepted Israel, and all you need to do is work out the modalities, the specifics. I reject that. I believe there is a war. A war is underway. Now, granted, it's a weak side and a powerful side, so it's not a conventional war, but it is a war nonetheless, a psychological war, a terrorist war. And on one side, you have the Palestinians, be they Hamas or Palestinian Authority, not much difference between them. Yes, personnel are different, tactics are different, but not much different in that both attempt to eliminate Israel. And on the other side, you have Israel that wants to be left alone. Now, I see the outcome of this conflict, this war, either leading to an Israel that's accepted by the Palestinians and left alone, or no Israel. Those are really the only two alternatives. I do not see the painful concessions by Israel, brokered by the US, the EU, and other authorities, will get us to a resolution. The only resolution is the Israelis win and they're accepted, or the Israelis lose and there's no Israel. Those are the only two. That's the way it was in the old days, in the 50s, 60s, and it's, I would argue to you, the way it is today. All this gloss doesn't change the reality that it is a war for the existence of Israel, or non-existence of Israel. And in this light, I think this means that Israel has to win. The goal should not be a negotiated settlement. You don't negotiate a settlement with an active enemy. We did not negotiate, say, with Hitler. We do not negotiate now with ISIS. We first defeat our enemies and then we negotiate. And thus, the same with Israel. It must win. And we should help it win. What does winning mean? Winning means that your enemy no longer attempts to achieve its goals. Think of World War II. Huge, huge war. And at the end of it, the enemies were crushed. Their will was crushed. They had made no attempt to go on. Or reverse it. Think about Vietnam. We lost. We gave up. We did not try to continue the warfare. Likewise here. The American goal should be to help Israel win, should help Israel to defeat its enemies so that its enemies no longer are aspiring to their goal, namely the elimination of Israel. This will only happen if those enemies, the Palestinians, feel a sense of despair that they cannot achieve their goals. It's not a pretty process. War is horrible. But there is a war. And once there's a war, it needs to be won. And the recent events, the violence that's taken place in the last few days, is just a signal, once again, that this is a war, and a war has to be won. And it doesn't get won by making concessions. It gets won by being strong. There are increasingly voices in Israel that understand this. 15 years ago, there were very few. Now there are increasingly voices that understand this and say, we need to win. And America's role should be to help us win. And I think that's what our role should be. Enough of this diplomacy, which has failed and failed and failed. And arguably, we're in a much worse situation today than in 1993 because of the failure of this diplomacy. So let's give up on this diplomacy. No more Kerry running to the Middle East, trying to bring them together. Thank you. But the U.S. government helping our ally defeat its enemy, just as we're trying to defeat ISIS at present. So the Israelis should defeat not just Hamas, but also the Palestinian Authority. It is the enemy. It's not a partner for peace. It's an enemy. Isn't that clear? Doesn't we need more information? Moving on to Egypt. Egypt is a country I lived for 3 years and have great affection for. I speak Egyptian Arabic. It's a country that's in decline and decline and decline. It's a large country, 85 million people, living in a tiny area. As you're probably aware, the Nile River Valley essentially holds all of Egypt. It's incredibly packed. It has been under military rule since the same 1952 that I referred to before. 62 years of military rule with 1 year none from 2012 to 2013. Military rule is not happy rule. Military rule is corrupt, it's oppressive, and Egypt, which was a country with a future in 1952, is really a country without a future now. There are desperate problems, economic problems, desperate problems between the Islamists who want to apply Islamic law and the anti-Islamists who don't want to apply Islamic law. I worry that Egypt is in a decline that will be deeply harmful to Egyptians and to the neighborhood as trouble comes out of Egypt. Egypt used to be called the breadbasket of the Nile. It was historically a country that exported wheat and other foodstuffs. No longer. It is the single largest importer of food, both in absolute and relative terms. Well, in absolute terms. Relative terms, over half of its caloric intake comes from outside. But the Egyptians don't have the money to buy that food. So they're depending on the Kuwaitis, the Emiratis, and the Saudis to give them money to buy food. It's not a tenable situation, and I worry very much that it will lead to starvation, lead to explosive political developments. So, of the many problems in the Middle East, I think the Egyptian one is one of the most severe. Finally, about American foreign policy. George W. Bush, as a result of 9/11 and the Iraq War, came to believe that the United States could reform and rehabilitate the Middle East, just as we had done in Japan and Germany. we would do it in Afghanistan and Iraq. We would defeat the governments, we would take over the countries, we would fix them, we would repair them, and we would leave them free and prosperous, to quote his words. Well, that didn't happen, and it didn't happen for many reasons. Japan and Germany were different in many ways from Afghanistan and Iraq. Our wars were very different. Those were deadly existential enemies. These were not anything like that. And so as a result, we spent the order of $1.5 trillion, which even in the United States is a lot of money. We lost on the order of 7,000 dead, and many more wounded. We had a major conflict in this country in 2005, 6, 7 over Iraq. We paid a heavy price, and we have nothing to show for it. And every day that goes by, Iraq and Afghanistan bear less and less the impress of the American effort. And so in 2007 arose a politician, Barack Obama, who said, that's a mistake. We should disengage. We should pull out of Iraq, we should pull out of Afghanistan, and more broadly, we should pull out of the Middle East. This is not an area where we can make much difference. And if we leave them alone, they'll leave us alone. And so we went from one extreme, namely the Bush grand ambitions, which failed, to the Obama minimal ambitions, which also failed. You can't just leave the Middle East. The Middle East won't leave you alone. Whether it be terrorism or extremist ideologies or atrocities or building up of nuclear weapons, the Middle East is trouble. And the Obama administration has been reluctant to get involved. And insofar it has gotten involved, it is to work with our enemies. Sorry, I skipped over Iran, I'll get back to it. But the major effort, the major initiative, is to cooperate with Tehran, and to a lesser extent with the allies of Tehran in Iraq and in Syria, and to pay little or no attention to the wishes of our allies, be they strategic allies like Israel or tactical allies like the Saudis. And so the U.S. presence in the region is down, the U.S. influence is down, the U.S. authority is down, and for the first time, now I'm a foreign policy analyst, and one of the great pleasures of being an American was that you represented a really important country, and as you went around the world, people paid attention to you because you're American. Well, it doesn't feel like that now. It feels like I could come from Finland, you know. It's not so important coming from the United States anymore. People kind of discount the American role because it's inconsistent, it doesn't really make sense, it doesn't stand for our interests in the way it has, whether it be Democrats or Republicans in office before. So American influence is in steep decline. Now, of all the developments taking place, and there are many, I've only touched on some of them, think of Libya, Tunisia, Yemen, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, many other issues. No doubt the most important of all is the Iranian nuclear buildup. And should the Iranians get the bomb, not only will it change the region, but arguably it could change the world. And that the Iranians, I'm switching over to my last subject, the Iranian nuclear development. The Iranian leadership is apocalyptic. It is very focused on the end of days. It believes that we live at a time when the Mahdi and the Dajjal and the other figures of Islamic eschatology might be appearing. And so even more than Stalin or Mao, the possession of nuclear weapons by the Iranian leadership could lead to their choosing to deploy these weapons, to use these weapons. And not only use them, but use them in a new way. As you may know, there's something called electromagnetic pulse. In short, if a nuclear weapon explodes in the atmosphere, or on the ground, it sends out a pulse, electromagnetic pulse, that destroys the electric networks, grids that are not protected. Ours is not protected. And so we are vulnerable to Iranian nuclear explosions in our atmosphere. 2 nuclear explosions, one in the west and the east, would effectively knock out the American power grid. Well, think about that. Think where our food would come from, our water, everything would come from electricity. Some government panels have concluded that 9 out of 10 Americans would die were this to be the case. Essentially, anyone who doesn't live in rural areas. So it's not just Israel. It's not just the Middle East, it's us as well. It is absolutely imperative to stop the Iranians from building nuclear weapons, from weaponizing and deploying nuclear weapons. Now, someone else might say, well, they're not going to do this. It's not really on their minds. And that person might be right. But that's an interesting discussion for a seminar. It's not something we want to find out for real. So I think more than anything else, we need to stop the Iranian nuclear buildup. And while I'm perfectly happy to save the Yazidis in Iraq and bomb ISIS, I think it is a catastrophic mistake to do what the Obama administration is doing, and to ally in some fashion with the Iranian government against ISIS or against anyone. Iran is the ultimate problem, the ultimate danger, not ISIS. ISIS is, as the Israeli ambassador said, Iran is 1,000 times more dangerous than ISIS. We need to keep our eye on the ball. Iran is the problem. And here we are closing up. There's talk of diplomatic relations being reestablished for the first time since 1979. We have released all sorts of funds. Various corporations, particularly in the defense area and in the oil exploration area, are beginning to approach the Iranians. We are facilitating their getting nuclear weapons. There are many mistakes that the U.S. government has made on both sides, as I suggested earlier, Bush, Obama. But this is of a different order of magnitude. This is truly dangerous. This could come back and have the most tragic impact, not only on Israel, the Middle East, but also on ourselves. So it seems to me the absolute priority is to stop the Iranians. And while the explosions that have been taking place in the Iranian facilities and the targeted assassination of Iranian scientists and the computer viruses have all slowed down the process, it's clear that the Iranians are proceeding, that the centrifuges are whirring away every day, and that they're getting closer step by step. And really, the only way of stopping this is through force. And there are only 2 countries in a position ready to do this, namely Israel and the United States. But I don't think the United States is anymore. I think we, as of a year ago, in the signed agreement with the Iranians, have said basically we're not going to use force. And so it's just the Israelis left. The Israelis have other things on their mind, distracting things like Hamas. But this is the existential issue. Israel has, in effect, pushed away all the other dangers. And this is what remains. And let me conclude with Israel is unique in history for having such an array of threats against it. To start with the most violent and go to the least violent. Weapons of mass destruction. Chemical, biological, and most importantly, nuclear. Conventional warfare. Low-intensity warfare, or terrorism. Economic boycott. A demographic challenge, right of return, Palestinians overwhelming the Israeli population. And delegitimization, boycott, divestment, sanctions, and so forth. So there's 6 things. Weapons of mass destruction, conventional war, terrorist war, economic war, demographic war, and political war. I think there's never been a state that has faced so many different challenges at the same time, ever. But the Israelis have effectively dealt with 4 of the 6. Conventional war, not a prospect anymore. The only possibility would be Egypt, and that's not likely. Terrorism, well, it does exist in a small way still, but looked at from a strategic point of view, not not very significant. Demographic, well, strikingly, Israel is the only country in the world that has a demographic rate that's going up. Only one. The Israelis are doing very well demographically. Economically, the Israelis are doing very well. Yes, they're boycotted by the surrounding countries, but this is a modern economy with a high-tech and other industry that is selling to the world. You know, they're well integrated into the global economy. And finally, delegitimization. While this has not been fully dealt with, and the Swedish government recognizes Palestine, the French parliament is about to vote on this, the British one did, various stores won't handle items coming from Israel, universities are in constant turmoil over the recognition of Israel. By and large, I don't think this is a major threat to Israel. It is a nuisance and it's a problem. So the only one that really remains is weapons of mass destruction. This is the threat to Israel's existence. And so, assuming that the United States and all other countries are not going to take the drastic step of attacking Iranian nuclear facilities, I hope the Israelis will. It's a difficult undertaking, it's far away. They don't really have the aircraft for that. They have fighter aircraft. They don't have bombers like we do. They go from Louisiana to Afghanistan. It's going to be hard, but I don't know what the alternative is. Yes, there'll be problems. There'll be problems in the operation itself. There'll be problems in the aftermath of it, worldwide condemnation. Who knows what the Iranian response will be? One has to expect disruption in oil supplies, terrorism against Israel, and so forth. But that all looks rather small compared to the problems that would follow should the Iranians get nuclear weapons. And so it's a strange issue because we don't really know what's going on. We don't know the status of the Iranian nuclear buildup. We don't know if the reports we get, rumors of which we get, are accurate enough. We don't know if they bought one from the Pakistanis or the North Koreans or several. We don't know where things stand. And there are these tedious and ineffectual talks, the P5+1, that are scheduled to end in 12 days. We don't really know what's going on. In contrast, say, to ISIS, where we know, we have reports, we have dramatic information, it's gripping. But yet I'd argue to you that ISIS is a sideshow, and the Iranian nuclear development is the main show. And our government appears to not to be effective, and so it's essentially left to the Israelis. To some extent, our fate is in Israel's hands. Will they take this terrible step? And more than that, if they attack, because the Iranians have the personnel, the material, and presumably the will to continue this program, it might be necessary to attack again and again. Now, mind you, the Israelis are the only ones to have ever disrupted nuclear programs, and they did it twice. In Iraq in 1981 and in Syria in 2007. And in both cases, the programs ended. So there is some evidence to suggest that when Israel hits your nuclear program, you call it quits. But probably we should assume that the Iranians won't call it quits and will rebuild, in which case the Israelis have to do it again. So it's a very major and unpleasant undertaking that will be costly and problematic in many ways, but I don't see that there's an alternative. And I don't see that there's anything in the region quite as important as this. So with that, let me thank you for your attention and welcome your questions and your thoughts. Should I do my own? I guess I should. So, Jerry.
All right, thank you. I agree with 99% of what you said.
All right, let's hear about the 1% again.
1% is major because you and everyone else fails to address a particular subject. You come to the conclusion, rightfully so, that it's time for the Israelis to ignore this 1993 debacle and not think in terms of peace with the Arabs or a Palestinian state. We have another problem in this country where there's also a mindset that isn't being addressed. The fact that the United States is in a position of decline politically, militarily, economically, because of the action of the head of this government. The fact that these things are not accidental, that this person, we have to address this person and our problems in light of the fact that these are deliberate weakening of us. I'd like you to address this possibility, and the change of mindset is necessary. Just as we have to declare who is the enemy, it's not some terrorist enemy, we have to declare who is the enemy to this country that's causing this demise of our country.
Okay, let's do that. I don't know that you disagree with me in that 1%, it's just I didn't address that 1%.
Exactly.
Well, I personally see the United States as an extraordinary positive development over the last, not even 2 and a third centuries, but really 400 years. The emergence, the historian of the United States named Walter McDonald wrote a massive history of the United States, and he started by saying that the major development of the last half millennium is the emergence of the United States. I agree. I go further and say it's a very positive one. It has affected not just Americans, but people around the world. As an American, I go to other countries and I see that we've saved them, and we've helped them, and we've improved them in countless ways. America has been a very positive force, and especially in the last century since World War I. Well, there's another point of view, which is that America is a curse. America is a problem. America exploits. America meddles. And you can develop a history of the United States that just focuses on that. The most famous is by Howard Zinn, History of the American People, People's History of America, it's called, which just focuses on the negative. And the facts are not wrong. You can indeed show a very nasty side of the United States. Fair enough. We're not angels. We've made our share of mistakes. But I would argue that that is a distortion. It takes the negative and takes it from the margins and puts it at the center. Wrongly. But that is a point of view that one finds on the left. And the further left you go, the further the antagonism towards the United States, both domestically and internationally. Barack Obama is on the left. And he subscribes in large part to this point of view. The United States has been a force for ill. And therefore, if you are then president, you want to reduce the force for ill that the United States has been. The trouble is you're caught in a dilemma, because on the one hand, you see the United States as a force for ill. On the other hand, you're the president of the United States, and you want to be seen as a successful president. You want the historians to, say this was a great president. And that pretty much means standing up and being a strong president and wanting the United States to do well. And so I think he's come in a conundrum where Mondays and Wednesdays he is trying to reduce the power of the United States, and on Tuesdays and Thursdays he's trying to increase it. And so you have this incoherent foreign policy that simply makes no sense, where he's being buffeted by these two conflicting agendas. And he's not purely Howard Zinn, but he's not a patriotic president either. So you have the challenge of being a left-wing American president, where you really don't like the United States in many ways, but you are trying to be successful. And I think that explains a lot of the incoherence of American foreign policy around the world and in the Middle East especially.
My name is Bernie. Thank you for being here. If you could address focusing on what's going to occur next year, a change in the White House. What would you expect to happen? What would you want to happen? And what change in foreign policy might be possible?
Change, I think you mean in 2017. It's not quite well, just thinking, what would I like to see happen, what I expect to see happen? Let's just stick to the Middle East that we want to talk about. I would like to see somewhere between the Bush overreach and the Obama underreach. My formulation, my advice to an American president would be protect Americans and American interests. Don't go out and try and change the region, and don't withdraw from it and try and not be a player there. Both of those are harmful to our interests, but rather look to see what are our interests. By the way, the slogan of my think tank, Middle East Forum, is promoting American interests. It seems to me that we should promote it as Americans, but also, not less importantly, I think the world benefits when we pursue our interests. We are a generous power. We are not selfish, and others gain as well. So promoting American interests, looking at any particular situation, Arab-Israeli, Egypt, Turkey, Syria, Iraq, Iran, and saying what is best for the United States, and how do we accomplish this, would be the approach I'd like to see. So not transforming the Middle East, not fleeing from the Middle East, but in the Middle East, elsewhere too, of course, to say, what are our interests here? What are our national interests? What is best for Americans, for American values, American corporations, business, American allies? What is best for us? How do we achieve this? And I think with that rather simple approach, you can find results. And of course, there'd be a huge debate over what American interests are, but you could find, you'd be having a constructive debate that would lead to intelligent policies.
My name is Nick Papanikolaou. I'm a Greek by birth and an American by choice. I think I'm probably one of the few people in this room who has had personal contact with people like Mahmoud Abbas, his Vice Minister of Foreign Relations, one or two Ayatollahs from Iran, Deputy Leader of Hezbollah, and last but not least, Christians from the Palestine area, whether they're Orthodox or Catholic. I've had that contact because 12 years ago I co-founded an NGO called the World Public Forum for the Dialogue of Civilizations, and we've had for 12 consecutive years meetings on the island of Rhodes in Greece, where, by the way, the first peace treaty that Israel signed, entered into, was signed there, negotiated there and signed there. And we bring about 600 to 700 VIPs together from more than 60 countries for 5 days every year on the island of Rhodes to talk about culture and religion and so forth. So as a result of that forum, which I co-founded and co-chaired, I've had the opportunity to come into direct contact with some of these people. And what I want to say is that I agree completely, not 99%, 100% with what you said. Israel is at war. And these people, even the Christians from Palestine, have a hatred for Jews and Israel that is just beyond comprehension, beyond description. And so there are only two outcomes to this, as you said very correctly. Either Israel is going to continue to be powerful and not be lulled into these silly, land for peace arguments and maintain the upper hand and maintain their respect through power, or it's going to be lost completely. And I can tell you that not only from talking with the deputy leader of Hezbollah, but the Ayatollahs, even Mahmoud Abbas, who has worked hard at establishing a sort of a, affable, compromising attitude. But as you correctly say also, if you look at what he's been doing the last couple of years, he's switched, completely off. And now he's even arguing that Israel should not try to Judaize Jerusalem. Come again? Judaize Jerusalem? And who is he to speak? And with what background? So I agree with you 100%. That's what we're in. And I hope that Israel on its own and through its friends is going to maintain that position of power, because it's the only way to survive, period.
Thank you.